Good afternoon, everybody. This is Dylan with NASEO. Thanks for dialing in to today's webinar presented by the NASEO's Transportation Committee. We're just going to give it another minute or so, give people time to dial in, and then we'll get started. Hi, everybody. Thanks again for joining today's webinar. Today, we're going to be taking a look back at EV roadmaps in order to find lessons learned and support states as they start to develop new roadmaps or revisit existing ones. So today, the transportation system is relying on electricity more than ever, and states and utilities have been working to try to provide the infrastructure to really enable this transformation. It's only going to keep growing. Just last month, we saw 15 states and the District of Columbia sign a memorandum of understanding to support electrification in the medium and heavy duty sectors. So this is something that is just going to keep growing. So we wanted to wrap our heads around it. So for this webinar, the Transportation Committee wanted to revisit previous electrification roadmaps, and in order to examine lessons learned, compare how expectations met the actual implementation of the roadmaps, and see what states might have done differently. Also, equity in transportation electrification is something that keeps coming up. So we wanted to bring in the Greenlining Institute in order to speak to how they have worked to get equity concerns integrated into EV planning and really ensure that the communities that have suffered most from air pollution and are associated with vehicle travel can really be part of the solution and gain access to this new infrastructure. So today we have three great speakers lined up. I want to take a quick moment to introduce them. And so we have MK Anderson, who's an energy project manager for the Iowa Energy Office. She mostly focuses on alternative fuels, alternative fuel vehicles, and she also serves as the coordinator of the Iowa Clean Cities Coalition, which works to increase the usage of all fuels across Iowa through education, outreach, and technical support. After MK, we have Jeff Bristow, who serves as the Regional Energy Program Manager with the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection within their Energy Programs Office. So Jeff is based out of their Northwest Regional Office and has over 25 years of experience managing the development and implementation of energy programs, providing technical assistance, education, financial assistance on a range of energy issues, from transportation to energy efficiency and renewables and rural issues. Also schools, and he covers a lot of issues, but he's here today to talk about Pennsylvania's transportation electrification roadmap that was released last year. And then finally, we have Ramon Partida Lopez with the Greenlining Institute. He's the legal counsel with their environmental equity team, working with the team's legislative and regulatory efforts on transportation electrification, mobility equity, and climate investments and supporting community groups that seek funding to advance their own community priorities. Roman believes that in order to see the change we want, we must ensure that lower income communities of color have a seat at the table in order to help identify the solutions to help drive climate investments that will improve air quality and economic opportunities within these communities themselves. He grew up near San Diego, and the early exposure to toxic chemicals and pollution really led him to basing his career around this work. So we're gonna turn to the presentations in a minute, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. There's a few different ways you can ask questions. There's a questions tab on GoToWebinar, so you can type in questions to me through there. There's also a raise hand feature, so you can just indicate to me you have a question, and I'll call on you and you can ask the question yourself. Or if that's not working for you, you can just shoot me an email at dtucker@naseo.org. So without any more prep, I will pass things over to MK and she'll kick off our presentations.
All right, can everybody see my screen?
Yeah, we can see and hear you.
Excellent. Well, hi there. As Dylan just said, my name is MK Anderson. I work for the state of Iowa's Energy Office as a project manager, and I'm really focusing on all things alternative fuels and advanced vehicle technology. Today, I'm going to be covering lessons learned from our 2016 report called Advancing Electric Vehicles in Iowa. Just a bit of background on that. In 2015, IEDA was legislatively mandated to do a study to see what was needed to spur electric vehicle adoption in Iowa. We were tasked with coming up with recommendations for the legislature, and this is what came of that. I do want to mention that this report was created by my predecessor, Stephanie Weisenbach. I met with Stephanie to discuss the report creation, lessons learned, and then kind of compare to how things have changed today. So I may not be able to answer all of your questions, but I will be able to find the right person, and I will definitely do my best. So today I've divided my points into two different parts. The first is what we wish we had done differently, and then the second is what we're really glad we did and we have seen been successful. So to start off, we would have provided more information on an EV specific time of use rate in this study. And maybe explore that through smart charging or interaction with the utility at the station instead of just a time of use rate in general. So a time of use rate that's not designed for EVs may not be as beneficial to an EV owner and could actually be economically detrimental to the owner and the residents depending on the electricity that they use at their residence. So for example, if you're using more electricity during peak times, like your washing machine, your dishwasher, your TV, their EV would use the electricity at night in the off-peak times, but if you use a time of use rate that's not specifically designed to mitigate that, the bill could actually be significantly more depending on the household use. Another thing we would have done was an analysis of what electric vehicles in the state are currently, or were currently at that time, contributing to the road use tax fund, and compare that to other comparable sized passenger sedans. So what some of our stakeholders are finding is that EVs are already being charged more just because of the weight of the vehicle, just simply with the battery being heavier than the ICE comparable size sedan. And so as a result of not doing this, we didn't have any information or any kind of analysis along the line to offer DOT when they proposed and passed legislation for increasing the EV registration fees. We found that the maps produced specifically for level 2 EV station location and placement throughout cities and zip code specific were not as helpful and utilized as we'd hoped. We're kind of finding that communities don't need to, but maybe just don't really think of level 2 planning as something that needs to be, I guess, planned like that. So it's kind of just like an added bonus for the customers of their business, say. And so that just didn't translate to the community as we had thought it would. And then we would also analyze the potential electricity use increases statewide that would happen due to electric vehicles, both interstate and the ones that are traveling through. This would be really informative for grid-related planning. And then if we were doing this report today, with all the recent advances in potential heavy-duty trucks, we think it would have been helpful to address the potential infrastructure and policies for those as well. And then lastly, we would have addressed EV readiness opportunities in zoning codes and building codes so that cities could really be EV ready if they wanted to. Moving on, things that we're glad we did and seemed really successful. The scope of work that was created with the consultant that helped us with this report included meetings with stakeholders that would help further refine the scope of work. So the consultant would ask the stakeholders what type of information and education would be helpful for them and their stakeholders, and then that input was used to shape the education-related aspects of this report. We created an interstate corridor map, and then related information was presented at the same time with that. And that was used many times after the report was complete and really helpful for our future efforts in EV station planning. But we do wish that we would have expanded upon this and created a phase 2 map. So really in that map, it's just our 2 FHWA designated alternative fuel corridors, which are currently I-35 and I-80. And we think that it would have been helpful, especially now, to have prioritized other corridors that could come as a phase 2 investment. A thing that was really wonderful and brought a lot of attention to the report, we provided electric vehicle in Iowa, just like total numbers. And that figure was cited in the media multiple times, which brought a lot of attention to this report. And then lastly, although it was pretty controversial at the time, this report covered the resale of electricity and the definition of a public utility in Iowa. So for those of you who don't know, in Iowa at the time, you were not allowed to sell electricity even for electric vehicle charging stations, because that would be considered a public utility in our state code. And so the report recommended changing that, and it provided examples of other state policies that have that caveat for electric vehicle selling. And then, so our recommendation on this report was, of course, cited multiple times when it came out, but then again, years later, when this policy was being considered more seriously at the IUB. And a couple of years after the report was done, the stakeholders and decision makers that were ready to tackle this policy change did so, and the new rule went into effect, and now EV charging stations can charge by the kilowatt hour instead of by the time that the vehicle spends charging. And so that was just a good, I guess, reminder to show that what may be controversial today could change in the very near future. So that it took 2-3 years to get that changed and not be controversial. And I'll take questions at the end, but here's my contact information if anyone ever wants to ask me anything that they didn't get to ask in this presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, MK. And we'll hold questions to the end, but feel free to type them in now if you're thinking of any, and we can just circle back to them later. And I will pass things over to Jeff now.
Thanks, Dylan. Can you see my screen and hear me okay?
Yeah, it's not full screen, but we can see it.
There we go.
There we go. Yep, and we can hear you fine.
All right, thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an overview of the process that we use to develop the EV roadmap in Pennsylvania and some of the lessons learned. So this is going to complement MK's presentation, where she talked a lot about the results of their planning process and what maybe they would do different related to those results. I'm really going to focus on the process and the stakeholder engagement and talk about the lessons that we learned. And the same, if we were going to do it over again, here's what we would do differently. or here's what we liked and we would do again or do more of. So like many states in recent years, we recognized that the trend for electrification was headed our way, and so we decided that it would be appropriate to begin the process of preparing Pennsylvania for that and begin a planning process that would assess the state of the EV marketplace in Pennsylvania and then identify opportunities to expand it. And we began this process in 2017. It went well into 2018, and then we had a delay, and it did not get published until February of 2019. And this process was initiated by the Energy Programs Office within the Department of Environmental Protection. And like Iowa, we used expert consultants to help us with this process. We used a company called Ibora and Associates in conjunction with Meister Consultants Group. But we also involved a very lively and engaged stakeholder group that became known as the Drive Electric PA Coalition. And the coalition was made up of a broad range of EV stakeholders, from state and local governments to companies within EV business, EV consulting, utilities, environmental groups, OEMs, just a broad range of interests. And the reason that I point this out is I'm going to come back because, as I said, the engagement and involvement of the stakeholder group in my mind was very key. And there's some things that maybe we could have done better with that I'll talk about. The roadmap in our process, we approach this to tackle it in three main elements here. First is, let's assess what the state of the EV market is in Pennsylvania. And doing that in two basic ways is, one, let's benchmark where we are in terms of the number of EVs, the availability of charging infrastructure, and then also what are the barriers that's preventing expansion of EV availability in PA. And then the second major element was to identify strategies to address those barriers and to overcome those barriers. There was a third element that I'm not really going to spend much time on in this presentation. We did a component of this roadmap was to do some modeling on various levels of EV-related policy deployment, combined with technology advances to see how that might affect the adoption of EVs in PA, and then the resulting energy and environmental and economic implications of that. Again, not going to go into details on that, but there's an entire section in our roadmap dedicated to that. In terms of the outcomes, just real quick on a couple of things here. And these next two slides actually tie to information or something that I want to talk about in our lessons learned. But so one of the things that we did was we tried to, like I said, benchmark where we were in Pennsylvania in terms of EV penetration. And one of our stakeholder partners in this, the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission, took registration data of vehicles in PA and ran them through a VIN decoder, and were able to lay out the EV registrations by census block data in PA. And no surprise, the bulk of EV registrations are in the southeastern part of the state, in the Philadelphia metropolitan area and outlying areas, and then also another concentration in the western part of the state around Pittsburgh. And whereas just about every county in the state has at least one EV registered, it's sporadic in the rural areas, which is to be expected. And then the charging infrastructure, no surprise, also matches up with the metropolitan statistical areas as well as where the EVs are registered. The major output of our roadmap was really the development of this set of 13 strategies. And whereas it sounds like that the Iowa roadmap was really directed towards advising the legislature on what could be done in Iowa, we were a little more wide open with this. So this was not really specific to legislation or all about policy. There's different types of strategies in here. I'm not going to go through these in detail. They're categorized in those that could be implemented or should be implemented in the near term, up to 2 years, then up to 5 years in midterm, and then long-term 5 years and beyond. And they can be categorized also in terms of those strategies that are geared towards outreach and education, those that are related to financial incentives, and then those that might be more on the policy or legislative side of things. And that's just a quick overview. And what I'd like to do is talk about some of the things that we felt were very important in the process that maybe we would do differently and that I wanted to kind of highlight here. And I have 2 slides on this, and the first one has to do with making sure that we set the parameters for the roadmap process. And what I mean by that is we need to define the scope and clearly communicate it. Is a roadmap, is it going to be focused on a particular geographic area, or is it going to be on a statewide basis? And are we looking at possibly doing the EV roadmap and developing strategies across all electrification possibilities, across all EV potential, light duty, medium and heavy duty, public transit? We decided in our process that we were going to do a statewide roadmap, and we were going to focus on plug-in light duty vehicles. Now, certainly, as we develop strategies, there's some overlap with some of these other areas like medium and heavy duty. For example, as one of our strategies has to do with outreach and education towards fleet operators. Well, certainly there are going to be fleet operators that are using a mix of vehicles, and they may be very interested in the medium and heavy duty, but our roadmap plan was really targeted towards the light duty plug-in vehicles. I have on the end of that line there fuel cell electric vehicles, and the reason I put that there was we did not include fuel cell vehicles as part of our roadmap for light duty EVs. And this ties to where I say, hey, let's clearly communicate this. It's really important because in the stakeholder process that we used, it was very wide open. We had stakeholders. We didn't have a defined set of stakeholders in a closed room, and that was it. We actually had an open process that at any point we could get new stakeholders coming in. And late in our process, in fact, I think we even had the final draft of the roadmap just about done and ready to go. And we had somebody join our stakeholder group that was representing the hydrogen fuel cell industry. And they kind of took exception to that it being left out, and it created a little bit of controversy towards the end of our roadmap planning process. And it kind of just distracted from things. But I think we could have done a better job clearly communicating from the beginning in our roadmap as to really what it was about, and making sure that the folks who joined in our stakeholder group understood that. So that was definitely a lesson learned for us there. Also about the intended audience, we could have gone about this in many different ways, but one of the things that we wanted to make sure was that just because our agency was leading this effort, we wanted to make sure that we were coming up with a document, a roadmap that was for Pennsylvania, not just for our agency to implement. So that's definitely a question to ask if you're entering into this process of who is this intended for. And in our case, we left it kind of wide open. It would be interesting if we started this process over again, if we would do it like that, and I think we probably would. And I think also another related element to that is, what is the goal? Are you going to set a goal? Or are you going to kind of leave it wide open and just see what are the opportunities here? When I talk about goal, I mean a numeric goal. We did not enter into this with to identify a specific target of 25% market share by 2030 or anything like that, or percent registration, or even greenhouse gas reduction. In fact, if we go back and look, one of our our strategies actually is to establish statewide EV goals. So we didn't really know at the beginning what a good goal would be. We did that type of analysis, but we did not have it as a driving factor in this. Another lesson that we learned in this process was making sure that we understand the age and completeness of our baseline data. And so the point that I want to make here is that the process that we went through to develop the EV roadmap took, I'm going to round it up to 2 years. It wasn't quite 2 years, but from the time we started till the time it was published, almost a 2-year process. And we were dealing with 2017 data. And as I mentioned, there was a delay and it didn't get published until 2018. And as you can see from this slide, the market situation changed pretty substantially from 2017 to 18 and then into 19, but we did not have this data available to us. And that really, when we published it in February 2018, we knew that part of it was already outdated because the market is changing and moving so fast. So that is something that we learned along the way. In terms of the other major area where I want to talk about lessons learned has to do with involvement of the stakeholders. And a strong stakeholder group is really essential. And there's different ways that you can approach this. As I said, we approached it as a kind of a very open. We had open meetings on a periodic basis related to the EV roadmap development, and we welcomed pretty much any stakeholder who wanted to come in and participate. But we did identify some key participants or champions early on from utilities and some other agency folks who we knew could help drive the process. And it's really important also that we found out that you need to have an active and meaningful engagement of stakeholders. In other words, you don't want to just have stakeholders that are there to, review a draft and give comment, but actually engage them in proposing, developing, and prioritizing the strategies that are being worked up in that roadmap. In fact, like Iowa, what we did was we actually built it into our contractors, into their contract, the task that they had to facilitate that stakeholder group. And that really worked out well for us because one of our contractors, Ebor and Associates, has some significant experience and expertise in association management, and that really helped us in engaging the stakeholders and getting buy-in and ownership in the process. Because leading to my last point here, and this is probably the major point that I will make out of this entire presentation here, is that every step of the process of the roadmap should be geared towards implementation. Yes, we want to identify the baseline, we want to identify strategies, but we also want to make sure that we have the elements in this document that lead to implementation. We want to build that expectation within the stakeholder group in order to get their participation in the implementation. So each strategy really needs to be action-oriented and should include steps for implementation. And what we ended up doing was we worked up the strategies and we identified that, hey, if we move to implementation, here is who likely should be involved with this. But because of the delay in getting our roadmap published, and because our main person who was leading our effort from the Energy Programs Office took a new position, we lost quite a bit from the end of the roadmap planning process to the beginning of the implementation. We lost some momentum there. And I think if we had to do this process over again, one of the things that we would do is not necessarily make a full implementation plan for each strategy, but probably take at least those near-term ones, the 0 to 2 year ones, strategies, and develop the kind of flesh out an action plan for next steps to begin implementation of those. So those would be the main lessons learned and how we would handle things maybe differently if we move into an update of our EV roadmap into next phases and expand it, or if we were to have to start this whole process over again. And Dylan, that is my last slide.
Great, thanks so much, Jeff, for that really useful presentation. And I will pass things over to Roman now, and then after his presentation, we will have time for Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Dylan. Dylan, can you see my screen all right?
Yeah, we can see and we can hear you, so all set.
Great. Okay. It's always such a concern. Hello, everyone. My name is Roman Partia Lopez, Legal Counsel with the Greenlining Institute. And yeah, I think, just a quick thought before I jump into the presentation. I think definitely what's been shared thus far, I think has kind of been building on each other, right? From what MK talked about to what Jeff just shared, and really thinking about the planning and the implementation. And so for us is really, for Greenlining and what I'm about to talk about, is really gonna take a step back and really think about how we think through equity and some equity considerations as you all think through the development of, EV roadmaps or policies that will drive the transition over to electric vehicles, and how we're ensuring that everyone gets the benefit from these policies and roadmaps, but most importantly, those that are highly impacted by air pollution and poverty. So for those who are unfamiliar with the Greenlining Institute, we're a racial and economic equity advocacy organization based in Oakland, but as Dylan mentioned during my introduction, I'm based in San Diego, doing some local work and really helping build capacity and awareness for local community groups to help advance their priorities and help meet the needs of their communities. Our work is about 27 years old for Greenlining, and we've really been working to redress the impacts of redlining on low-income communities of color. More specifically, the work of the Environmental Equity Team, which is the team that I'm on, our work is really focused on reducing poverty and pollution in our frontline communities, our low-income communities of color. So quickly, I just want to kind of walk through what are the highlights of the next few minutes we'll have together as far as my presentation goes. And I really want to focus in, right, thinking about how we're taking a step back and we're assessing before we jump into thinking about how we're developing projects and policies to really unpack some of the injustices and inequities, right, and what led to that. Next, I'll get into some of equity guiding principles and standards we should consider as we're thinking about developing these policies and roadmaps. And then focus in a little bit more on how Greenlining is looking at this work and how we're looking to operationalize equity, but then also highlight some vehicle policies and projects that may be helpful as you all think about your development of roadmaps, or as you're thinking about updating any type of policy or project. So before I jump into any of that, I know I mentioned the word redlining, and I know redlining has definitely been utilized a lot more kind of at the national level and probably within the areas that you all are from, but wanted to just really focus in real quickly on this and highlight it and why this is important as one of these practices and principles that has really shaped how investment or lack thereof has happened in our most impacted communities. And so redlining is this practice, as you see in this map here, of communities being identified as financial risk and therefore not receiving the necessary financial support to help really improve the conditions of those that reside in those communities. This map here that you see is one of Oakland, but if you were to actually look up redlining maps, there is probably certainty that you'll be able to find one for your particular community, and you'll see what communities have been left out because of these practices and therefore how they've been impacted over the years. Another practice that I wanted to highlight was the various highways that were built over the years and the impact that that's had on communities. This right here is just one picture, right, of many that we can compare, but how freeways have really separated and bisected communities, similar to here what we see in LA. And then lastly, really thinking about kind of putting it into like more current implications. As you can see here, we're highlighting 3 various maps, right? One that's really focused on redlining and kind of the map that I showed 2 slides ago. But then in the middle, you see Cal-Enviro Screen, which is a map that has helped determine our most impacted communities here in California. And if you were to compare those 2 maps, both redlining and Cal-Enviro Screen, you could see the overlap in red areas, right, between those 2 maps. But now if we were also to compare that with COVID and the impacts that it's having on our communities, you'll also be able, it also highlights the disparate impact on our most impacted communities that show up in these 3 various maps, right? Which tend to be low-income communities of color, more specifically Black and Brown communities. And so, in order for us to really think about any type of policy or project, this type of background information, I think, is needed to really highlight how we're going to move and ensure that we're centering equity in the work that we're doing. And so, in order to do that, we need to start addressing these transportation injustices that we see, right? That have plagued our communities for years, that we have yet to rightfully what's the word I'm looking for? I'm sorry. Address by the current systems that we have. And part of the reason that exists is because there is that lack of community power and engagement, right? One of the things that was brought up earlier by Jeff was, how they're engaging how they're engaging stakeholders and kind of what that process has looked like. And from Greenlining's perspective, you definitely have to have active community engagement and stakeholder. We must have stakeholder engagement, but as part of that, it also has to include community groups and community members, as this will impact them, and it's important to have their voice to be part of that. And then as we think about new mobility and the impact that that's having, ensuring that it also doesn't create additional inequities in communities, right? Is this new mobility option right for the community that you're looking to engage and potentially provide this new opportunity, new transportation opportunity? So I've been talking about equity, and I think I want to just take a quick step back there as well and provide our perspective on what we mean by equity, right? As you can see from this image, I think there's been a lot of use of terms between equality and equity, and I think it's important to draw that distinction. So when we talk about equality, right, it really means that everyone gets treated the same and one size kind of fits all solution. But in equity, when we talk about equity, it means that the solutions are tailored to meet the various needs of the different groups, as you could see from the image that is here. And for us, for Greenlining, equity is about really transforming the behaviors, the institutions, and the systems that disproportionately harm oppressed groups like low-income community folks, people of color, women, LGBTQ, elderly, and people with disability. Equity is about increasing access to power, redistribution of resources, and eliminating barriers to opportunity. And most importantly, empowering marginalized communities to thrive to their full potential. So with that in mind, I wanted to share the following principles and standards that we feel provide an equitable framework for any type of policy or roadmap development. These principles and standards, we feel, provide the best opportunity to embrace systemic transformation and meaningfully address the needs and concerns of priority communities, our most impacted communities, as we begin to think about how mobility and electric vehicles will benefit all communities, how we think about a recovery from the current pandemic that we're in, how we think about kind of long-term, short-term and long-term visions for improving mobility in these communities. And again, it's really just centering on how we think about this in a way that will address the climate-related impacts that our most impacted communities feel. So we hope that any type of standard, any type of a policy or roadmap really thinks through these various principles and standards, that it delivers targeted race-conscious investments, that it's really focused on community-driven solutions, right? The community is going to know best the type of solutions that are needed to help improve the transportation needs of that particular community. So really focusing in on that is really important. We must really think through what intentional benefits we're looking to drive in the communities. But as well as we think about benefits, we also need to consider and avoid any type of burden that this type of policy or program will have on our most impacted communities. It must deliver a comprehensive approach, meaning that, again, kind of to that one size fits all approach is not probably the best approach to ensure it's meeting the various transportation needs of communities. This idea of a comprehensive approach is that we can't just address transportation by itself, right? We need to think through transportation, but then also think about economic opportunities and be really intersectional about the work and the type of policies that are passed. And then we must ensure that we're providing capacity building and technical assistance, right? When we think about stakeholders, I think we think mostly about utilities, local agencies, and governments. But in order to have, again, a complete process, we've got to include the community. And at times that also requires that there is some level of education that's happening with community groups and communities to help them have the capacity needed to engage in these practices so that their voice is also heard and that they're meaningfully engaging. But in order to do that, we must also compensate them, right? We can't just rely on their time. There must be some level of compensation. And that's what we mean by really building that capacity. And again, establishing paths towards wealth building. We can't address one component at a time, right? We must address how are we addressing air quality, but then also thinking about how we're addressing the economic opportunities behind that. And so how do we do that? Greenlining has really developed this framework around how we are operationalizing equity in the various levels of planning and implementation, right? So if we're really serious about addressing equity, equity must show up in every aspect of the development process, from thinking through the goals, values, and mission, but then also about how the process, how implementation, and how the analysis and measurement goes. It must, the lead and its stakeholder group must really think about how equity is going to show up in each of these various components. But one thing I just want to really highlight, right, as we think about this operationalizing equity framework, is that it needs to prioritize community engagement. And what does that community engagement process look like? Right, it needs to start with a community needs assessment, right, to determine, what are the mobility needs of a particular community, right? We may be talking about EVs, and that may be important, but there may be some other pressing needs that need to be addressed first. Before we get to that, before we get to transportation, electrification, or some type of other new mobility option. But in order to get to that, we first need to determine what those needs are. Right? We need to educate the community on mobility equity and what that means. And then we need to brainstorm with the community, right, for those project ideas and how we develop these short-term, mid-term, and long-term strategies to help meet those needs. Then we move into developing a mobility equity analysis, right? And based on what was provided by the community, really start analyzing, what projects are best suited to meet the needs of the community. And based on that, really start prioritizing projects on all that information. And then lastly, really thinking about that community decision-making power, right? It's not enough to just engage community and ask for their input, right? Or just inform them of what's happening. It needs to really drive a spectrum, right? From informing all the way to providing some decision-making power so that they feel that their input is valued, that they're being heard, and that we're actually implementing and developing policies that are shaped and that will benefit their communities. And so, with all that in mind, I wanted to share the following examples of, how we see equity in EV policy, right? And for you all to consider as you're thinking about roadmaps and even when you think about some type of, metric that's attached to it, right? And so, as you see here, these 4 examples, right? When you develop policies and that don't have equity, you have goals similar to what's being identified here, right? 1 million EVs by 2023. But when you center equity and you include that in there, you see how that goal changes from just 1 million EVs to 1 million EVs by 2023 with low income programs, right? So that you're developing, so that you now have something accountable that requires you to look back and reflect on whether you are meeting that component of developing low income programs. Rather than setting up a vehicle incentive program that's just standard for everyone, when you think about equity, you're developing one that really provides more financial support, incentive-wise, but that's really targeted at low-income folks. Like you see here, the scrap and replace program that's offering $9,500 to low-income consumers to get rid of their old car and get into an electric vehicle. And then, lastly, when you think about just EV awareness campaigns, right? Then just having a massive EV awareness campaign that's targeted at all, you really think about how you're developing a culturally relevant EV awareness campaign that's going to speak to the various communities that reside within your state or within your community, right? So that you're really being intentional of how you're addressing the various needs of communities. And I know this requires different types of partnerships and relationships, but in order for these roadmaps to be effective and for these policies and roadmaps to really address equity and address equity, but then also really consider the past inequities that haven't been addressed, it needs to really center equity and ensure that the community is involved in developing those processes. And I know I don't have a slide to this because I know we want to leave some time for a Q&A, but recently Greenlining was able to participate in the development of the city of Berkeley here in California's EV roadmap. And through that, we provided some of these recommendations. As they built out a stakeholder engagement group, it wasn't just Greenlining and a set of other stakeholders. It really was intentional of how they reached out to community groups, how they partnered with them, how they compensated their time, and how that information was then incorporated into the roadmap itself, so that you build out a roadmap for 5 to 10 years so that it's addressing those needs, but that it's also then adaptive in need be given a change in circumstances, because what may be a priority now may change in 5 years. So I wanted to close by saying that in order for us to ensure that these policies and programs are really addressing and centering equity, we must be bold. We must really think about how we're centering equity, and it must be inclusive, and it must ensure that the communities that are most impacted are part of the discussion, conversation, and decision-making process. So thank you for your time, and I'll turn it back over to Dylan and to Q&A, I believe.
Great, thank you so much, Ramon. And yeah, we will move to the Q&A portion of the webinar. So just as a reminder, there's 3 different ways you can ask questions. There is a raise hand feature, so you can just indicate to me that you have a question and I'll unmute you. You can also type it into the question part of GoToWebinar, or you can email me. So we have one question that has come in, and it is from Jeff Morris, and he's wondering, did any of the EV plans adopt a minimum amount of 24/7 resilient public EV charging in case the grid fails to help people evacuate? Like perhaps a formula like 20% of EV capacity needs to be resilient. So I guess this is probably more for MK or Jeff.
I can go ahead. For Iowa, it was not considered in the EV plan or the follow-up one that we did last year. I just don't think that our state is quite there infrastructure-wise yet. And, we definitely saw the effect of that during derecho this week. Last week, excuse me. Many people are still without power. And I think it was a really awful way to highlight the importance of that.
And in Pennsylvania, we did not set a target like that either, but that is certainly something that we could look forward to as we add resiliency to maybe part of our goals or targets in an upcoming version or update of our EV roadmap.
Great, thank you. I know that Florida's legislature recently passed a bill that provided funds for an EV roadmap, and it does include resiliency as part of their evacuation their evacuation routes from the state. So that could be a good example to look to in the future. And I had a question for Jeff. So you mentioned that it was your office that created the roadmap, but the intention was to make it a statewide document. And then you discussed a lot of the stakeholder process in developing the roadmap, but I was just wondering if you could speak to a little bit about the implementation and if you were able to bring in the agencies that you work with to help flesh out the implementation plans, or if that was kind of a second level of the struggle.
That actually, I think, is one of the better outcomes of the implementation piece. Like I said, we had a pause between when the roadmap was done and when it was published, and our lead person had left during that time as well. However, that lead person went into a position that was involved with coordinating among agencies, not only transportation related or alternative transportation related issues, but other energy issues as well. So that person was in a good position to help kind of put the agencies together for implementation of various elements of the EV roadmap. Like I said, the implementation piece was the hardest piece in my mind, because now we really have to kind of engage people to actually start taking some additional steps. We were able to use this process to forge a stronger partnership with our counterparts at the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation and at the Public Utility Commission. They've been very great to work with as we've been putting together implementation plans.
Great, thank you, Jeff. And we'll just hold to see if any other questions have come in, but I don't see any more at the moment. Oh, here we go. For Jeff, how was the Pennsylvania EV roadmap implemented if there was no greenhouse gas reduction to strive for? And was there a way to categorize the 13 different strategies that you listed?
Yeah, so like I said, the simplest way that we had categorized them was in the near term, midterm, and long term in terms of the target time frame to implement them. While we did not have a specific greenhouse gas reduction target driving the roadmap, we did, in that modeling piece that I talked about, we did identify greenhouse gas reduction and criteria air pollutant reduction as part of the impacts that we were assessing. Pennsylvania does have an overarching 80% reduction of greenhouse gas by 2050, which is something that we had identified as part of the roadmap as we were entering into the roadmap process. But what we didn't do was say, here's the specific amount that we're targeting from transportation. So if you look at the strategies we developed, some of those, we're still able to move into the implementation phase and look for metrics in terms of the effects of on registration, EV sales, EV availability, and things like that.
Great, thank you, Jeff. And I got one additional question. I'll just open up to whichever presenter wants to cover it. But Katie from Idaho is wondering if you have any recommendations that would help ensure the state's EV roadmap is adaptable for the future as new issues and concerns arise.
Well, this is Jeff. I'll take that. So we are keeping together and continuing to meet we've been meeting on a 3 times per year basis. We're actually going to bump that up to 4 times per year with our Drive Electric PA Coalition. and we are updating, we intend to update the data, the baseline data, and then look to update the roadmap strategies themselves as we get into implementation and move into other phases. For example, as Pennsylvania just signed on with other states onto the medium and heavy duty MOU. And so we have opportunity, I think, to update our EV roadmap and our strategies, and we have the elements in place to do that, and that's our intent over the coming years.
Yeah, and if I could chime in here, Roman, with Greenlining. Yeah, I mean, I think building off what Jeff said is important to continue to engage the stakeholder group and have some type of structure, right, where there is some analysis happening on a regular basis, whether that's on a yearly basis or some other benchmark, right, that would trigger some type of analysis, so that if there is a need to be adaptive and change some of the strategies that have been identified, you know, that there is that opportunity because there is analysis happening, and obviously they're reflecting on it, so that you can make those needed changes to kind of steer the ship in the right direction.
And then this is MK. I just wanted to, I guess, build off what Jeff and Roman both said. And I think that it would be helpful to think of it as a living document that you will return to as those things get triggered that Ramon was talking about. And then if you just put that right away in the language for the expectations, then people will know that as technology is changing and the market evolves, that this document will change and look different.
Great, thank you for those answers all. Well, I don't see any other questions and we're coming up on the hour. So I just want to take a minute to, again, stop and thank the presenters so much for taking the time to share your work with NASEO's members. We'll be making a recording of this available on NASEO's website and also posting links to the 3 presentations. So if you need any more information, feel free to reach out to me or circle back in a couple days and we'll have it up on the NASEO website. So thanks again, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Bye.